Hey everybody, Grommel's here with a new DCS video. Now, in my last DCS videos I was flying some helicopters, which are great and awesome fun, but a little bit on the slow side, so I figured to mix things up a bit this time we fly something a little bit faster again. Specifically the Sukhoi Su-27, also known under its NATO name Flanker. Now, I thought I want to take a look at the Flaming Cliff 3 planes and introduce those a bit too, since they are, compared to the full modules, not too expensive. $10 for a plane or Su-27 for all of them, and not as complex as the foil modules in DCS, so they are a good way to start with DCS if you are new to it. Now, what are Flaming Cliff's planes? Well, the history of DCS can be traced back to the simulator Su-27 Flanker from 1995, the first sim by Eagle Dynamics, the DCS developer, which was by the way the first simulator I ever played. And featured the Flanker, of course. This was followed by Flanker 2.0 and then in 2003 by Lock-On Modern Air Combat, which in addition to the Su-27 also had the Su-33, the carrier version of the Flanker, the MiG-29 in 3 versions, including the one used by the German Luftwaffe, the F-15C Eagle, as well as the A-10A and Su-25, the ground attack planes as flyable aircraft. Now, Flaming Cliffs was the add-on for Lock-On and added the Su-25T as a flyable plane. Now, DCS is an evolution of Lock-On, and as it was released with its current free-to-play and module system, the Lock-On planes were re-released for it as a module called Flaming Cliff 3. With the planes of course getting new 3D models and cockpits, as well as one by one new flight models, as the original Lock-On flight models were not as detailed as the ones now used in DCS. That was and is a somewhat slow process, since the DCS flight models are extremely detailed and complex, but by now there are only 2 planes left that don't have new flight models yet, that being the Su-33 and the MiG-29. Which is why you can't buy those 2 planes separately, though you can get them in the Flaming Cliff 3 pack. When they get their new flight models, the Su-33 first and then the MiG-29, they will also be purchasable separately like the other Flaming Cliff planes are now. The Su-27 Flanker of course has by now a full DCS flight model called PFM in DCS Professional Flight Model, which models the plane's aerodynamics and so on extremely detailed, and having that detailed aerodynamic to play with is quite fun. As far as system management goes, the Flaming Cliff 3 modules are of course not as detailed as the full DCS modules, and the planes don't have a clickable cockpit. But again, this makes them good planes to get a feel for DCS if you're new to it. I do hope we will eventually get a full module of the Su-27 Flanker. That is where Eagle Dynamics is coming from after all. Now let's talk a little bit about the Su-27 before we take a look at a mission or two in it to show off some of its capabilities. Now, the Su-27 is a 4th generation fighter, and its development started during the 70s, and as with most fighters developed at this time, it is influenced by the experiences made by air forces in the wars and conflicts of the 60s and 70s, like the Vietnam War, which showed that jet versus jet combat was going in a different direction than the analysts assumed it would in the 50s when the 2nd and 3rd generation jets were developed that were used in those conflicts in the 60s and 70s. Back then it was assumed that future air combat would be fought almost exclusively at very high altitudes and at very high supersonic speeds at beyond visual range using the new air-to-air missiles in development, and that traditional maneuvering fights would not happen anymore. As a result, the fighters at the time were designed with this philosophy in mind and put a strong emphasis on very high speeds and not much on maneuverability. And of course this concept of speed as the #1 factor for a successful fighter had turned out to be true earlier in World War II, so it was only logical to keep this concept up. However, experience in the conflicts of the 60s and 70s showed that, as is often the case, in reality things did not work out as the analysts had envisioned it for multiple reasons. The effectiveness of missiles at the time was not that great, but that wasn't even the primary reason. Engagements were also being mostly fought at lower altitudes and at slower speeds, as was assumed, as the primary task was still, for example, support or defense of ground troops, not the interception of high-flying supersonic bombers carrying nuclear weapons. Also, it was not always possible to attack at beyond visual range, as it was not always clear if the target was really enemy in such a scenario, and visual confirmation was still often required. And even if an engagement started at beyond visual range, since the fighters still had to fly more or less towards each other at high speeds during this engagement, it still often ended up at closer ranges very quickly. Now here the new missile armament of those fighters had another effect that was not foreseen by many. More traditional tactics of high-speed slashing attacks with speed and altitude advantage, followed by a zoom climb out of range of the attacked plane, is how it was done in the past during World War II, for example, and very successfully so. As a cannon or machine gun armed plane, even if it can get its nose pointed at the attacker as it zooms away from the engagement, will have to be very lucky to actually hit anything firing after it. The attacker was simply usually out of range of those weapons too quickly. This changes of course if the armament is not cannons and machine guns, but missiles with significantly longer range. In this case, using your speed to disengage from an engagement, as it was often done before, might instead just show your enemy your hot exhaust, making it easier for a missile to hit. So using your speed alone to disengage from a close-range fight was suddenly a lot more difficult than it had been in the past, and fighters, once committed, often had to fight it out. So the introduction of effective missile armament made the plane's as well as the pilot's ability to get the upper hand in such an engagement more important, not less, as was originally assumed. As a result, when the new fourth generation fighters were developed, while speed was of course still an extremely important factor, the ability of the fighter in slower speed maneuvering fights suddenly had an importance it did not have since before World War II. So most of the fourth generation fighters, F-15s, F-16s and of course the Su-27 flanker, show this shift in philosophy, and are more maneuverable in a close-range fight than the third and second generation fighters they replaced. Well, the Su-27's development started as a response to the development of the F-15 Eagle and resulted in one of the, in my opinion, best-looking fighters of all times. Just knowing you are so very pretty while cruising around the sky makes this plane a joy to fly. The Su-27 flanker entered service in about 1985, originally in two variants, one for the Soviet Air Defense Forces, which is more or less the counterpart to the US Air Force's Air Defense Command during the Cold War, concerned with defending their own territory versus aircraft. So this version was for air combat only and could only carry air-to-air weapons. The other version was for the Soviet Air Force and can also carry unguided air-to-ground weapons to give it some multi-role capabilities. This version, generally called the Su-27S, we have in DCS. Now, when this fighter entered service in the late 80s, it was certainly among the most dangerous fighters in the world, if not the most dangerous, in both beyond visual range and close-range combat, in which the plane is very maneuverable. As with many modern fighters, its maneuverability also comes from being inherently aerodynamically unstable, and it needs a fly-by-wire system to be flown. While this system will keep the plane stable, it is less restrictive than what you find on similar Western planes, allowing the plane some more maneuverability, but also allow for pilot mistakes. It is very much possible to get the flanker in an inverted flat spin, even with the flight control system on, for example. In emergencies, the system can be turned off, which makes the plane very hard to fly. Turning it off without an emergency is generally a bad idea, as the plane is very hard to control without it. However, since this also turns off the angle of attack limiter, turning on this emergency mode allows you to do, for example, a Cobra Maneuver. This is mostly an airshow maneuver and by many not considered that useful in an aerial fight, but let's face it, if you fly a flanker, this is one of the things you want to try. It is after all a bit of a trademark of the flanker. Now, since the Su-27S we have in DCS is still in its original configuration, the flanker can only carry semi-active radar homing missiles for beyond visual range combat. There are 27R, for example, which need the flanker's radar to home in on the target, and therefore can only engage one target at a time and need to keep its nose pointed at the target for the missile to hit. The counterpart to the flanker in DCS, the F-15C, can carry newer AIM-120C MRAM missiles, which have their own radar seeker, giving the F-15 the ability to fire at multiple targets at the same time, and the F-15 does not need to have the nose pointed at the target for the missile to hit, so can take evasive action sooner after firing. This gives the F-15C a large advantage in beyond visual range combat. The radar warning receiver of the flanker also provides less information than their counterpart on the F-15. However, the flanker has its own set of tricks up its sleeve, which gives it the upper hand in close-range maneuvering fights. The plane is extremely maneuverable for one, also it is equipped with a helm-mounted sight and the pilot can lock a target just by looking at it, if it is within the cone of one of the plane's sensors. The R-73 short-range infrared missile seeker head is gimbaled and can look about 45 degrees to either side. Selecting those weapons, the pilot can control the missile seeker with his helmet-mounted display and lock the missile at the target without having to completely point the nose of the aircraft and the missile seeker at it, so it can lock and fire at the target at a pretty high angle. Another little trick of the flanker is its infrared search and track system. An infrared sensor and laser rangefinder on the nose of the aircraft in front of the pilot, which can be used instead of the radar to scan for targets and lock them. The range and ability are of course limited compared to the more powerful radar, and it can't guide radar homing missiles, but since it is a passive system, it can be used without giving your own position away like the radar will if it is turned on. That's not a new concept, but not many planes in DCS have such a system. The plane also has a datalink, so you have contacts on your screen showing up that are detected by your wingman or AWACS, for example, giving you a better situational awareness. Now, as I've said, the Su-27S has on top of its air-to-air capability also a limited air-to-ground capability. While the plane can't carry any smart weapons, it can carry and use the usual range of unguided Russian rockets and bombs, the S-8 and S-13 rocket bots for example, and unguided bombs from 100 to 500 kilo, as well as cluster bombs. The 100 kilo bombs come in multiple ejector racks with 6 of them on each, so it can carry a total of 36 100 kilogram bombs. And while those weapons are unguided, if the situation is favorable, no wind for example, the plane's avionics can help you to use them relatively accurately. Well then, that's some basic info on the plane. Let's take a look at 2 quick engagements in the Su-27 flanker to show off its capabilities a bit. Now, this first one is just from a very quick training mission, which the simple objective being to attack and destroy a flight of 3 F-15C Eagles. Now, as I've just mentioned, the F-15 is superior in PVR combat, and there is 3 of them, so the plan is to approach them in low-level flight using the valley as cover to get within short-range infrared missile range, attack and pop in and out of the valley for cover. The optimum would be if the enemy planes don't notice me coming at all, and I can do a sneak attack using my infrared tracking system without giving my position away. Which is why my radar is turned off in this case, as this would give away my position immediately. However, the AI is pretty good with the radar and will find you very quickly if you show up in their detection range, even for a short time. It is however still possible to get the warning from the radar warning receiver, but be outside the radar's cone of detection. Now, since I got a quick warning from my radar warning receiver of the enemy plane's radar, I have to assume they spotted me, so I changed direction to the right to hopefully confuse the enemy planes and then show up from a different position than they expect. I turn my infrared tracking system on and pop up out of the valley, looking in the direction where the initial warning from the radar warning receiver was coming from. I can detect him right away, but I also get locked up by the enemy radar. I want to fire an infrared fire and forget missile and then duck back down into the valley for cover, but it takes a little longer than I would have liked for my missile to see and lock the target. When it does though, I get the launch authorization fire and dive back down in the valley. Not a second too late as it turns out, as the enemy planes were firing AMRAAMs and Sidewinders at me at the same time. I however was in a position to take cover from the enemy missiles quickly enough to not get hit, while my missile managed to get a hit on an enemy plane, so we are down to 2 of them. Since it worked well the first time around, I again want to pop up out of the valley, lock one target using my passive infrared system, and then duck back down after firing a fire and forget missile. However, the 2 enemy planes are a lot closer this time, and just as I pop up over the ridge, a F-15 shows up right to my right, very close, so I switch to my helmet-mounted side to lock it up quickly. I fire my second R-27T missile at the F-15, and I wait a little too long in taking cover because I wanted to see if I hit. I get a lock-on warning from the second F-15 and I dive back into cover, but I'm not in a position to go back into the main valley. I can see that my missile missed its mark this time. However, the closer F-15 did have to take evasive action and is therefore currently not pointing its nose at me, so I decide to pop back up and start to engage the second F-15 a bit further behind before the second one gets its nose back around. I lock the second F-15 with my helmet-mounted display and fire a R-73 close-range missile. And then, as I get a lock warning again, go into a high G barrel roll as defensive maneuver and launch countermeasures. I did not get a launch warning, just a lock warning, but you won't get a launch warning from a Sidewinder or an AIM-120 till it is too late. I start to turn around, and as I look back I can see the F-15 I fired on is trailing smoke and losing altitude. Seems I hit it, so there's only one left close by. I get it locked up with my helmet mounted sight, and since the seek of the missile is gimbaled, it can see the enemy plane at a high angle and attack. I fire the missile and I hit the target. So this is it for this little training exercise. Now, since the Su-27 also has some multi-role capabilities, let's take a quick look at the second scenario that shows this off a little bit. Now, in this scenario we carry two 500 kg bombs, and the task is coming from the north to drop them on an enemy cargo plane parked on the airfield here. The problem is that the airfield is protected by a SAM belt with Patriot long range and Hawk medium range anti-air missiles, so we have to stay as close as possible to the ground to stay out of the SAM's engagement envelope. There's also the chance to run into enemy fighters as we approach, so we carry a full air-to-air load on top of our bombs. A very important tool in this scenario is our radar warning receiver in the lower right corner of the screen. While it won't tell you as detailed what you are getting targeted by as the RWR in the F-15, it is still a powerful tool. The lights arranged in a circle tell you of course from what direction a radar is being detected. The orange lights show you direction to what the RWR considers the primary threat. The smaller green ones below the bigger orange ones the direction to secondary threats. The lights at the bottom show you the type of the radar, for example AWACS, ground-based long range or medium, or airborne if it is a fighter. If it is just showing the direction to the threat, it means that the radar is not actively locking you. If it is, you get a lock warning and the inner light turns constantly red, and if it starts blinking, it means that it detected a missile launch and the radar is actively guiding a missile towards you. That of course only works with semi-active radar homing missiles. But this way I can determine the rough location of the SAM sites and I know if they locked me up or fire at me. Now, while I fly through the SAM belt, I keep track on the type and direction of the radar. I am not getting locked up at the moment. I think I am too low for the SAMs to see me at this point. From the lights at the bottom of the RWR, I can tell that so far everything I am detecting is ground-based stuff, medium and long-range radars, but then suddenly the light all the way to the left, showing an X, also lights up, and this one indicates an airborne radar, a fighter. Now that I detect a fighter radar does not necessarily mean it has detected me yet, so I keep my own radar turned off to not give away that I am here if I am not detected yet, though I turn my infrared system on, but it can't see an enemy plane at this point. I then get a lock warning, but no launch warning yet. At first the RWR showed the ground-based radar as main threat, so what was locking me was not the fighter, but then it quickly changed the main threat to the airborne radar, meaning the fighter is now also locking me in single target track mode. It knows I'm here, so no point in trying to hide any longer. I turned my own radar on and I get a contact and lock it up. I fire a missile as soon as I am within maximum launch range. It is unlikely that the missile will hit anything at this range, but the point is that the enemy fighter will get a launch warning on his RWR and hopefully takes evasive action, keeping him from guiding a weapon towards me. I also get a launch warning now, but my options are limited. I can't climb because I am in the middle of the SAM belt, and as soon as I gain just a little bit of altitude, they start firing Patriots and Hawks at me. So I can do only limited evasive maneuvers and launch countermeasures, hoping my missiles will get the enemy plane to turn and lose lock. Those engagements with semi-active radar homing missiles often have some similarity with a game of chicken. I also had to roll to the side to fire my missiles, as if I don't do that when launching at this low altitude, there's a good chance that the missile will hit the ground below you, explode and damage your own fighter, and yes, this did happen to me once. Eventually though I do hit the enemy fighter and it goes down, so I can continue towards the objective at low altitude. As I get close enough to it, I pop up to gain altitude as quickly as possible and do a diving attack at the enemy airfield and the cargo planes sitting there at high speed. The idea being to, after the attack, duck into the valley behind the airport and take cover there before SAMs can reach me. I drop my two 500 kg bombs as soon as I'm in range and turn hard to the left and dive towards the safety of the valley. As I dive down and look back, I can see explosions on the airfield. I get locked up by the SAMs from the SAM belt as well as radar-guided anti-aircraft guns on the airfield, but I don't get hit, and once I get low enough into the valley they lose their lock and I'm on my way back home. Now on the way back home I get the warning of airborne radars behind me, fighters that scrambled from the airfield. I still have 4 short-range missiles left, but I'm still in the SAM belt area and can't climb, and I'm almost out of fuel. I have just about enough to get back to base. So I just keep going, hoping they won't catch up to me, and they don't and eventually give up and I fly home, landing with almost no fuel left. Well, and this is it for this video. I hope I could show you some of the capabilities of the Su-27 in DCS and introduce the plane a little bit. And this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was entertaining, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.